All right, ladies and gentlemen of Old Testament, this is your replacement for in-person lectures for the week, a video lecture on Abraham. We're going to be looking at Genesis 11, the very last part of Genesis 11 that after what we talked about the other day with the Tower of Babel, and going through Genesis 22. This is probably going to get a little longer than a normal lecture, but I'm trying to combine material that we might have covered in the 2 days this week and try to get us to a significant point so that we actually have enough time to do everything we need to do for the rest of the semester. And I have to tell you, this has been frustrating today. It is 5:20 p.m. as I record this, and I started on this at 8 this morning, or 9 this morning, and it has just been a mess trying to get this going. But here we are. I think we've got everything in order. So uh, grab a hold of pen, paper, whatever you need, and get ready. I'm going to switch to view now. I've got a uh, document pulled up that will show basically like what I do with the whiteboard in class. Um, you'll be able to follow along with these notes. Um, so we're looking at talking about the story of Abraham, and Abraham is a significant, like really significant figure. So I really hate to be doing this way. It's where we are in the semester. Ideally, we would have two or a little more than two lectures to deal with Abraham, but this is what we've got because of the way the weather went. The Abraham is a really major transitional figure for Old Testament studies. And he is going to remain to be a very significant, important figure through the rest of the Old Testament and through the rest of even into the New Testament. Um, the there is kind of another significant transition with Jacob, who becomes Israel, and Israel is what the tribe or the people group ends up being called for the next several hundred years after this period, after the time of Jacob, and there's other significant things that happen along the way, but all the way through the Old Testament and even very much into the New Testament era, uh, the people of Israel see themselves as the sons or the descendants of Abraham. And to the point that Jesus talks about in the New Testament, talks about the Pharisees and the religious leaders and their devotion to Abraham and seeing themselves as sons of Abraham. And Paul in the New Testament letters will deal with the attachment or the connection that Jewish people feel to Abraham. So the Abraham is a really incredibly significant figure for Old Testament studies and for understanding even well into the New Testament. Uh, and it's appropriate also that, I mean, Abraham is the figure that transitions us from the primeval history that we've been dealing with in Genesis 1 through 11, and now we're moving out of that period and into the period of the patriarchs, and Abraham is the first of that line of patriarchs. We'll talk about when we talk about the patriarchs, we talk about the major figures that show up in the remainder of the book of Genesis: Abraham and Abraham's son Isaac and Isaac's son Jacob, and then to a lesser extent Joseph. But Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are the ones we think of primarily as the patriarchs. And the stories of those plus Joseph during Jacob's lifetime will carry us all the rest of the way through the book of Genesis, basically. And so here we are. We're transitioning. We're talking about going to be talking about Abraham. And Abraham starts his name is Abram to begin with, and later as we'll see, there's a moment where God is making covenant, making promises to Abraham, and he changes his name from Abram to Abraham. And we talked about the other day. I mentioned that Abram, the name Abram meant or means exalted father, and the name Abraham means father of a multitude. And so the Av is the Ab is the kind of the root for father. And so when you see AB or AV in someone's name, there's a good chance that, especially in a man's name, there's a good chance that the name father or the word father is intended as part of that name. And so we have Abram, which is exalted father, and Abraham or Avraham is father of a multitude. Uh, Abraham or Abram is the son of a man named Terah, and Terah is we don't know a whole lot about him. There's other texts that are from outside of the Old Testament that became part of kind of Jewish culture, very significant to Jewish people, and that tell additional stories that may be true, that may be handed down even from Abraham's day, but they're less certain than the Old Testament text that tell some stories about Terah and his family. One of the things that we do know from the Old Testament text is that Terah had three sons. We have Abram, and then we also have Nahor and Haran. And somewhere along the way, we can see it mentioned of it in Genesis chapter 11. Haran dies, and Haran has a son named Lot, and Lot takes up with his uncle Abram, and ends up following Abram when God calls Abram to leave his people and go to the land that God would show him. And so Abram has this is the family, Terah, and his brothers Nahor and Haran. They also have children, specifically Lot, the son of Haran, who follows Abram. Abram is also married to a woman named Sarai, who will also, at the same time that Abram's name is changed to Abraham, Sarai's name will be changed to Sarah. But Sarah has this problem or this complication that is common in many of these stories in the Old Testament. This is a significant theme that builds through the Old Testament. The woman who is unable to conceive, the barren woman, the woman who can't bear children, um, and the way that God reverses their fortune or blesses them and allows them to conceive or does other things through them. So we'll see this theme repeated many times through the Old Testament. The woman who is unable to conceive, God blesses and gives children and uh, gives gives prosperity and joy and blessing. And so Abram's wife Sarai is unable to conceive, and the family of Terah, this whole household or this whole family, Abram and his father and his brothers and his wife and all of those who are part of their household, determined to leave the land that they have grown up in, to the land of Ur, just spelled U-R. The land of Ur, they're going to leave that land, and they're trying to get to Canaan. They want to get to the land of Canaan, but somewhere along the way, it's a long journey, and somewhere along the way, they stop, and it may be connected to the death of the brother Haran. It's not 100% sure, but somewhere along the way, they stop. They stop their travels, and they settle in a land that is named Haran, which is only one R in spelling different from the name of the brother that died. So one possibility is that they settle in a kind of uninhabited place where there aren't many people around, and it ends up taking on the name of the dead brother as kind of an honor or in memory of the dead brother. Uh, Not sure. Again, not 100% sure what's going on there. Some of the kind of outside of the Old Testament stories about Abram's family include that uh, one of Abram's brother, presumably Nahor, uh, is an idol maker. His occupation, his job, is to carve idols to worship. So he'll carve stone, or he'll cast from silver, or whatever. He makes idols, and people buy them and set them up, and that's what they worship. He makes idols of the gods in the region, or the gods that are worshipped in the region. People buy them for their place of worship in their homes or in other places, and that's how he makes his living. Which makes it extremely striking then that God calls to Abram, the other brother, and calls him to leave his family and to leave the land that he has known, and to worship this one God alone, to worship uh, one one true God instead of the many gods that even his family is engaged in aiding worship for. But the family of Terah is intending to go to Canaan. That's their objective. That's their goal. But they don't make it there. They stop in Haran instead. And that leads us to the next kind of big chunk, or the next transition is in Genesis chapter 12. This is where we really start to get the story of Abraham. Chapter 11, the end of chapter 11, just gives us some of his background and family connections. But at the beginning of chapter 12, God calls Abram. And when he calls Abram, he tells him to leave his family, to leave the land of his fathers, to leave the land that he has always known, and to go to a land that God will show him. God doesn't tell him where he's going. He just tells him to leave his father and his father's house and his land and take all of his stuff and all of his wealth with him and go to a land that God will show him. And Abram does it. God promises, one of the things to note is that when God does make this promise, this is in Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3. When God does make this set of promises to him, the first expression of the promise, it comes in this kind of 7-part form. And so God promises, that the text reads, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And so it's a 7-part promise, which is, again, in the Old Testament, in Genesis especially, the number 7 is significant. There's a kind of a completion, uh, the idea of completion or perfection. And so this is a resounding, it's a significant sound promise. And so this God makes this promise to him, and Abram does what God tells him to do and leaves his family, leaves the land that he had settled in with the rest of his family, and takes his wife and his nephew Lot and those that are part of his household that want to travel with him, servants possibly in his household, and his livestock, and leaves and just depends on God to show him where to go. Then it turns out that God shows him the land of Canaan. This is one of kind of the striking things. God shows him the land of Canaan that his family had been trying to get to. It was kind of the goal or the dream for his family to reach Canaan and settle there, and they hadn't made it. They fell short. They didn't get to Canaan, and they settled in Haran. But then God tells Abram to leave his family and to trust him and to go where he shows him, and he will give him a land and make him a family, make him a great nation. And when he does obey and he does go, God gives him the land of Canaan that was the land that his family was trying to reach in the first place. Um, and so that's this initial promise, the kind of first expression of the promise or the covenant that God makes with Abraham, and Abram trusts God and goes. And one of the things that is mentioned as being significant or striking in the text is that Abram builds an altar to God. Actually, he builds not in the place that God initially shows him that he will give him the land of Canaan, or give the land of Canaan to his ancestors, but he leaves and goes east of there, goes east of a place that would later be named Bethel, like our university. He goes to the east of Bethel and sets up another altar, and there he calls on the name of the Lord, and it's specifically because God appeared to him. And it's like the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring, I'll give this land." And so he builds this altar. And so Abram builds this altar because God appeared to him. And there's this kind of sense that his family has made lots of gods. That's the work that his family is engaged in. At least if the apocryphal stories about uh, Abraham's family are right. Um, his family has been engaged in making idols and in the worship of the gods for a long time, but no God had ever appeared to him. No God had ever shown up and spoken to him. And now here, Abram is called by God, by this God that he doesn't know, to follow him and go wherever he shows him. And the land that this God shows him is the land that his family had been trying to get to. And so Abram is convinced to follow this God, to follow Yahweh, because this God appears to him and speaks to him and promises to fulfill his family's hopes and dreams. Um, the uh, next part of this story is like that is all in the first half of Genesis chapter 12. The next half of Genesis 12 is an odd situation, and this is one of those moments where you should realize, and it's kind of the first expression of this trend that you're going to see all the way through the Old Testament, so be paying attention for it. Where the hero of the story does something very unheroic, and the again, this is going to happen so many times. We're going to see it multiple times, even just with Abraham. He's going to fall short. He's going to mess up. He's going to be very unheroic. And when we see this pattern repeated over and over again in the lives of practically every major figure in the Old Testament, uh, one of the things that we're supposed to understand from this, one of the trend, the things this trend is supposed to convince us of, one of the themes of the Old Testament, is that the story that God is bringing about, the intentions, God's plan for rescuing humanity, as promised in Genesis 3, uh, to the man and the woman when, you know, when God is pronouncing the first curse, as we talked about the other day. Part of the plan of God is to work through these very flawed, imperfect people to bring about his his salvation, to bring about what he intends. And it doesn't really depend on these figures so much. It doesn't depend on their perfection. And the primary figure, the primary character, the hero that is bringing about this salvation is not these figures, the Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and so on, all these people that we're going to be introduced to along the way. The hero of the story is God. God is the one that does what is right consistently over time to bring about the end, and the people that he uses along the way are all deeply flawed. They're human, and they fall short, they fail, and the plan still goes forward, despite all the obstacles that people bring about. But in this case, again, we've just been introduced to Abraham. Abraham has just left his family and left everything that he knows to follow God wherever he is leading him to go. And then the very next story is that there is a famine in the land. There isn't enough food to go around. There's probably a drought or something. Whatever happens, there's not enough food to go around. And so Abram takes his family and his household and goes to temporarily live in Egypt, where there's no famine at the time. That there's plenty of food to go around. But he's afraid. One of the things that he is afraid of, that we'll see multiple times along the way, apparently Sarah or Sarai is quite beautiful, and he is afraid that people are going to see her if he has to be in this foreign land, if he has to be where he doesn't have his own kind of security. He is afraid that somebody is going to see how beautiful his wife is and kill him, so that she's no longer attached and they can just marry her and have this beautiful wife. And so he is afraid that this is going to happen, and so he tells Sarai to pretend to be his sister whenever they go somewhere. And so they move to Egypt, and while they're there in Egypt, he tells her to act like his sister instead of his wife, and she does. And turns out that Pharaoh looks out, sees her, and sees that she really is a beautiful woman and wants to bring her home for himself. And so he gives gifts to her brother, not realizing that it's her husband, and she gives him lots of livestock, gold and silver, lots of wealth. Pays her all this, pays Abram all this stuff as part of the kind of courting process, or the expected courting process for a marriage, especially with royalty at the time. Um, and then once Pharaoh takes her in Sarai into his household, all of his household starts getting really sick, and he doesn't understand why. And he figures out, or he asks his officials to help divine what the source of their curse or their misfortune is, and they figure out that it's because of Sarai, because she's a married woman. And so Pharaoh confronts Abram and forces him and Sarai and the rest of his household to leave Egypt, but doesn't try to take any of the gifts back. He's afraid of whatever God is protecting Abram, that caused this curse to come on his household, and so he doesn't try to take any of the gifts back. And so Abram leaves Egypt far wealthier than he went in, and in the process, there's like he tries to pass his wife off as a sister, and gets the Pharaoh's household curse, but he ends up leaving far wealthier than he went in, because of his dishonesty, which is again one of these kind of, it reflects this this pattern. God is protecting Abraham even though Abraham is not doing what's right, because God has determined to bring about the end, or the plan that he has set up through this man, in spite of his shortcomings and his failures. And that brings us into the next chapter, in Genesis chapter 13. Abram and his nephew Lot are forced to separate, because um, part of effect of them coming out of Egypt wealthier than they went in, and coming out with the gift of all these livestock. And then the time they've been there, they've probably been able to grow their herds internally as well as receiving all the gifts. They've become very wealthy, and part of that wealth is in livestock, and this livestock needs grazing land. If you have a large amount of livestock, and that's where a good chunk of your wealth is, which it would be for a shepherd, uh, you need lots of grazing land. And Abram and Lot are both wealthy and both have large herds. And so there starts to be conflict between their herd, their competition between their flocks needing grazing land. And so the people that they have watching their flocks start to get in conflict with each other, start to fight and argue with each other. And eventually Abram decides that the only thing that they can do, now that they have both become this wealthy, and they're kind of leading their own households in this way. Lot is not just a part of Abram's household. Now he is a wealthy man in his own right and has his own flocks. That the only thing for them to do is to separate, and it's better to separate on good terms than to wait for conflict to force them, and it caused some kind of deep, bitter family rivalry. And so Abram takes Lot up on a hill and says, "Look, our herds are too large. Our households have become too large to stay together all the time. So look out over the land and see where you want to go. You pick a direction, you go that direction, I'll go the opposite direction, and we'll part as family, part as on good terms." And so Lot looks out and he looks towards the east and looks towards the Jordan River Valley. He sees that the land is extremely green and well watered, and that there's cities here and there, so that there's people and trade as possible, and it looks really great to him. In fact, the language is that it is watered like the garden of God, and probably a reference back or reminder back to the Garden of Eden, that it looks that good to him. And so he chooses to go that direction, and Abram goes in the opposite direction. There is kind of an internal thing or an implied thing here that Abram is clearly the elder, and has clearly been kind of responsible for and leading Lot along the way, and is responsible for a lot of success. So Lot has some kind of family obligations to him, and the normal thing for a young man in this situation at the time to do would have been to defer back to the elder and let him make the decision about where to go. And it would have been a courteous thing and an expected thing, possibly for Abram to make the initial offer to Lot, but the expectation would have been probably for Lot to recognize his dependence on, and the benefit that Abram had given to him over time, and to respect Abram as the elder, and to demur and say, no, no, I won't make this decision. You choose, and I'll go in the other way. But Lot doesn't do that. He looks out, sees the obviously better land, and immediately goes and takes it. And says, "I'm going that way. I'll go to the east towards the Jordan River Valley, and that will be my land." And so whether that is fully going on in the story or not, it's not 100% sure. But either way, Abram turns around and goes in the other direction. And sure enough, the direction that Lot did not choose was towards the west, towards Canaan. And so the land of Canaan is the land that Abram turns back towards. And as part of that, the story there, as after they separate, God comes to Abram and speaks to him and says that he is going to give this land to Abram and his descendants. And so as far as he could walk over the whole land. And so the story kind of breaks off there with Lot heading to the east and settling himself, or finding somewhere to settle in the region around the cities in the plain, including Sodom, which we're going to be coming back to later. But so he sets out to the east, and Lot lives among the cities in the plain and pitches his tents near the city of Sodom. The next chapter, in chapter 14, Lot is no longer near Sodom or pitching his tents near Sodom. He is living inside the city, and so some time has passed, but he's quickly made his way into the city and is living in the city instead of living outside of the city as a herdsman, as he began, as his family began. But there's turmoil in the area. This very well watered, very green area is very desirable for a lot of different kings to take part in, or to have control over. And so there ends up being a war where Sodom and Gomorrah and a couple of other cities are in an alliance against a mess of other cities, and the king of actually these cities, Sodom and Gomorrah included, are kind of rebelling against the king that had already conquered them in the past. And this king comes back with his alliance of cities and starts trying to squash all of these rebel towns that have sprung up. And in the process, he ends up conquering Sodom and Gomorrah again, and doing a lot of damage, and then carrying off the people as captives and carrying off all the food and the wealth that he can carry, his army can carry, to take it back to their king. And so Lot ends up as part of this, the conquest or the capture of Sodom and its people. Lot is taken captive and carried off with them. And when Abraham hears about this, Abraham hears about his nephew Lot being captured amongst all of these inhabitants of Sodom. He goes and gathers all of the men of his household that he can, all of the servants and all the herdsmen that have lived with him, been in his household, and then a couple of other guys, or households in the area that he knows. He asks them to gather up and help, and then he sets off with this band, relatively small band of fighting men, of men of fighting age, to go and chase down this enemy army to try to rescue his nephew and bring him back. And he does. They end up catching up with this enemy army. They get slowed down because they're carrying captives and all this wealth off. Uh, they end up catching up to them, attacking them, and driving them off, and defeating them at least well enough to rescue the captives and to start carrying the wealth back to where it came from. And as he's coming back, he gets back to this plain, gets back to this region. There is this mysterious man, or this mysterious king named Melchizedek. And if you've taken New Testament with me, or probably with anybody else, you probably recognize this name, or at least I hope you recognize this name. It was a test question in my exams. This guy Melchizedek. This is going to be the only time really that we hear from him in the Old Testament. This is it. He's got like 3 verses. Verses in chapter 14. I'm looking at verses 18 through 20, 18, 19, and 20. That's it. There's 3 verses in the middle of the Old Testament, or in the middle of Genesis 14 about him. And it's in the middle of this otherwise not deeply significant story. Uh, but this Melchizedek figure becomes a very significant figure for interpreting and understanding Jesus in the New Testament, especially in the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews looks back to this Melchizedek figure quite a bit, to try to understand Jesus's role, Jesus's priesthood and kingship. But this Melchizedek comes out. He is the king of Salem, which is the name means peace, and so he's king of peace. And this Salem is probably the precursor. It's probably on the site that becomes Jerusalem later. And he is called not only king of Salem, but priest of God Most High. And it says that he brings out bread and wine, and then pronounces this blessing over Abram in the name of God Most High. And so this is significant because later we're going to have, when we get to Exodus and we get to Moses and that story, we're going to have God giving Moses these commandments for how the religious life of Israel is supposed to be organized. And part of that is going to be that Moses' brother-in-law Aaron is going to be the first of the high priests, and he's going to ordain all these other priests. But the line of the priests, and later, when Israel becomes a monarchy, and that there's a line of kings, the line of priests and the line of kings are never supposed to intersect. They're not supposed to ever be the same. The line of priests comes only from the line of Levi, the tribe of Levi, and only within Levi, only from Aaron's family. So even a more narrow family within the tribe of Levi. Uh, and the kings are never to come from that tribe. And so the priests and kings roles never overlap. They never intersect. And the first king of Israel, Saul, is actually going to end up being rejected by God, at least in part, because he jumps the gun. He loses patience while waiting on the priest at the time, Samuel, to come and make a sacrifice because he's afraid his army is going to run away out of intimidation and fear before the battle can actually come, and so he jumps the gun and makes the sacrifice, trying to keep the army's morale up. And God ends up rejecting Saul as king because he does that, because he doesn't wait for Samuel to make the sacrifice. He takes the role of a priest while he is king, and God ends up rejecting him for that and choosing David to be the next king. And so this line of priest and king doesn't come together in Israel later. Instead, we just have this one mysterious man. The only time that we have this in the Old Testament where the priest and king are together and it's okay is when we have Melchizedek come out as the king of Salem and priest of God Most High, and he blesses Abram in the name of God, and Abram gives him a tenth of all of the spoils of the battle, a tenth of the wealth that comes from the battle, which is, again, this is significant because this is the first time in the Old Testament that we have a recorded tithe, a tenth of something being paid, and it's being paid to this king of Salem, priest of God Most High. And so he's a significant figure. It's a big deal that Abram gives him the honor or the respect of a tenth of the spoils of the battle, especially when he had nothing to do with the battle. And he kind of honors him and acknowledges him as a king or as a sovereign, uh, as he comes out to bless Abram as in the name of God. And so this Melchizedek figure is like, this is it. This is all we're gonna get of him. But he's this significant. He is a significant figure that you'll need to at least recognize the name and description of, because of the significance that this king carries in the New Testament. So this Melchizedek comes out to bless Abram, and Abram gives him a tenth of all of the spoils of battle. But then afterwards, immediately after that, the king of Sodom comes out and offers Abram. He says, keep all of the spoils of the battle, keep all of the wealth of the battle. Just return the people to the cities. Let the people come home. Don't keep them as slaves, basically. And so Abram has no problem with releasing the people, but he tells the king, I'm not going to keep any of the wealth either, because I've taken this oath. I've taken a sovereign oath that I would not accept anything from you, so that no one can say that Sodom has made Abram wealthy, that the riches or the wealth of Abram comes from the king of Sodom or from the city of Sodom. And so he returns everything that is his share. There were other people involved in the battle. The allies that he went to talk to before he took off to chase down this army were involved, and he says, let them keep their share if they want, but I won't accept anything except for what my men have already eaten. So that's he returns everything, and Lot is returned home, and as we'll see, he not only returns to his place inside the city, but he becomes a prominent figure inside the city a little later. Again, we'll get there. In chapter 15, something very significant happens, and this is kind of following on this battle and the return and Abram handing back over all the wealth as he had promised, made a promise to God that he would do. Um, in chapter 15, after this battle, God comes to Abram and speaks to him in a vision and promises great reward. In fact, he promises Abram that that God will be his shield and his great reward. And Abram, even though he has kept his promise to God, he's been faithful on that front, and he kept the promise to return the things to Sodom and not keep them for himself. He is discouraged because he still doesn't have a son, and part of the promise that God had made to him is that he would become a great nation. And how is he going to become a great nation? How is he going to have this large number of descendants without having a child first? And he looks around after God promises to be his great reward, and he says, here is this man in my household. His name is Eliezer of Damascus. He is kind of the chief servant, or the kind of chief employee in Abram's household. And he says, I don't have a son at this point. If I die, Eliezer of Damascus, my chief employee, my chief steward, is going to inherit everything, and my name will just disappear. There won't be anything left for me. And so how can you reward me? How can you give me a great reward when I'm not going to have anybody to pass it down to? And then God tells Abram, this is one of the images that's very frequently mentioned in the Old Testament, or that's known as the Old Testament. God tells Abram to look up at the sky and look at the stars and count them if he can. And then God promises uh, your offspring, says, so shall your offspring be. Your offspring will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. Uh, and this probably doesn't sound as impressive as it ought to us. If you've been outside and looked up at the night sky recently, you may not have seen much. A few dozen stars in the sky is like that. Having that many offspring over several generations doesn't sound that impressive. But that's because we have a whole lot of light pollution. Our street lights and the lights, the headlights from our cars and things, all the light that we use to kind of help society function and keep people safe, also ends up getting broadcast out into the sky and then reflecting off of our atmosphere. And we actually can't see most of the stars that are there and visible. But if you go to very dark areas, or if you're like Abram in an age before artificial light was really an option beyond a campfire and a torch, uh, if you're Abram and you're in this period where you don't have artificial lights bouncing off the sky, the number of stars in the sky is just staggering. In fact, I highly encourage you here to go and uh, search on Google Images for this term if you've never done this, or if you've never seen the night sky with very little light pollution. Go to Google Images and search this phrase, night sky with no light pollution, and look at the images that pop up. Look at the pictures of the night sky if they come up. And even then, even with that, it's still not as brilliant. It's not as intense as if you're seeing it with your own eyes, because cameras just don't capture the light of the stars extremely well. It's staggering the number of light stars that you can see when there is very little light bouncing off the atmosphere. At this point, we're losing visibility of stars very quickly because of the amount of light we're putting into the atmosphere. So we don't see very many anymore, but they're there, and it's lots of them would have been visible to Abram when this promise was made, well beyond what he could count in any reasonable amount of time. In fact, because of the rotation of the Earth and the movement of the subsequent movement of the stars in the sky, there's no way he could have counted them before they moved and changed. So it's impossible for him to have counted the stars in the sky. And God promises that's what your offspring is going to be like. And there's a very significant moment here. This is a significant moment in the text where text says that God makes this promise that your offspring will be as numerous as the stars in the sky, and Abram believes it. And the text says that Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. And so that righteousness, the righteousness of Abraham, the rightness, or the his being in right relationship with God, or his goodness, is credited on the account of his trust or his faith in God, not on the basis just of what he has done. Because again, if you go just on the basis of what Abram does, he's up and down and back and forth quite a bit, as we've already seen. He passes off his sister as his wife as his sister because he's afraid that something bad is going to happen if he doesn't. And we're going to see other moments in the next chapter, for example, where he doesn't have strong enough faith in God. He doesn't trust God to fulfill these promises fully, and so he tries to take things into his own hands and pursue things by questionable methods fairly frequently. Uh, but God counts Abram, or considers Abram to be righteous, not because he is perfect in his actions, but because he deeply, genuinely trusts God, which is demonstrated by his willingness to leave his family and leave all these things, to leave the land that he knows and go where God sends him, even though it's made him kind of a wanderer and he's bounced around from place to place since he has been following God. Abram trusts God. He has faith in God, and that is enough for God's purposes. So he is counted righteous. Now, what's going to happen in the rest of the story is God is going to make a covenant with Abraham. And this is a concept that is probably not super familiar to us. It's not something that we deal with, but a covenant was a significant event in the ancient Near East. Uh, it's you could think of it as being something like a contract, but it's more and deeper than what we normally think of as a contract. It's just being a written, legally binding agreement between two people or two parties, two companies, or whatever the case may be. A covenant was not just a contract. It is like a contract in that there are terms that you can break, and there's a consideration of the penalties or the consequences if you do break it. But a covenant was understood to be something um, deeper. It was the forging of a relationship, of a binding agreement and contract, and people would, as part of the contracts, or the part of these covenant making, the covenant ceremonies, would, you know, make these oaths that would be basically intended to be extremely binding on themselves and their families, and asking the gods to punish them or to destroy them if they fail to keep it. And so it's a deep and solemn agreement. It's a binding relationship building agreement between parties. Um, Often, let's say, often termed phrased in terms of family commitments. And so, like, you'd have if two kings were forming an alliance during the covenant ceremony, they would refer to each other as brothers, as though that now they are one family because of this covenant. And if it was a covenant, say, between a king and one of his subjects, and this was very frequent, by the way. This happened a whole lot between the king of a region and the people that would farm the land. The king would make a binding covenant with the leader, or the head of the household of the farming family, and the agreement would be something like, it would be a binding covenant made between them, and there was an agreement between them about the protection and the services that the king would offer to the farming family, and an agreement about the percentage, or the total quantity of crops that the family would provide to the king and to the city. And so it was a contract, but they would often refer to the king in these contracts, or in these covenants, would be referred to as father, and the subject as son. And so they would be, again, it's kind of this uh, family language, because it's meant to be this deep relationship building agreement. And there's also almost always with these covenants, there'd be a symbolic ceremony, a ceremony that was filled with symbolism, and often there would be a self-maledictory element to these agreements, or the oaths, and the ceremony would have a self-maledictory element. And this term self-maledictory means that you are wishing on harm on yourself if you fail to live up to the covenant. uh, and so the example of the king and the farmer making a covenant, one of the kind of common ceremonies for that would be to write the agreement uh, in clay, or to carve it into clay or stone, and then you make multiple copies, and then you would break one of them, so that the basically, if I break the covenant, may it be to me as it was for this tablet. And so that there's kind of this this kind of built-in image of destruction or pain or suffering or harm if I fail to keep my end of this agreement. If I don't keep my covenant, may I be harmed in the same way as something. Uh, and these covenant ceremonies, in the Old Testament, most of these covenants are between God and His people. And we've already seen the Noahic covenant, as it's called, the covenant between God and Noah, where God promises um, not to destroy the world again, or to end the cause widespread death to the human race through flood. And the sign of the covenant there is the rainbow put in the sky. And now we have the covenant that God makes with Abram, and we're about to see the ceremony that God uses for that. And later, God will give another sign, a sign of the covenant, as kind of a lasting remembrance. That, again, we'll see that in a couple chapters. And then there's going to be other covenants that God makes with His people to come. But this is, for now, we've seen the covenant with Noah, and now we're seeing the covenant with Abram. Uh, Again, there are several varieties of these covenant making ceremonies in the ancient Near East. There were lots of them, lots of different varieties of them. One of the common ones, though, is being imitated. God is going to give instructions to Abram to set up this covenant making ceremony. We're going to see it in the rest of this chapter, in chapter 15 of Genesis. And the way that this covenant ceremony would have been set up is you would take animals, and you would slaughter them. The variety of animals varied, but in this case, God tells Abram to bring a heifer and a goat and a ram, heifer being a female cow, and a goat and a ram, each 3 years old, and then bring a dove and a young pigeon. And he's to take all of those animals and kill them, and then take their carcasses, take the corpse and cut it in half, chop it into two pieces, and then arrange all of the halves of these animals in kind of parallel lines, and that would the with the purpose being to create this kind of aisleway that you'd walk down. You can think of, if you've ever been to a church or to the chapel of the third floor of Campbell Hall, or even the auditorium in DFAB, where there's rows of seats on each side, and there's a central aisle that you walk down. But imagine replacing the rows of seats, or the pews in the churches, with dead animal parts, and that's what you have. You have an aisle to walk down between these rows of the halves of animals. And the way that the ceremony would go is that the participants in the ceremony, the people, the parties making the covenant, would state the terms of the covenant. They would say out loud in front of witnesses the terms of this agreement, of this covenant that they were making, and then they would walk down the aisle together. And the symbolic weight, the meaning, the intended self maledictory element is, if I break my promise, if I don't keep my covenant, may what has happened to these animals happen to me. May I be cut up. May I be killed and cut up into pieces and left for the carrion birds, for the vultures to pick apart. May I die and be left to rot if I don't keep my promise. And so that's the way that this would go. You'd have, it set up, you cut up the animals, you make this aisle between them, and the two parties involved would state their oaths, state their promises, and their part of the covenant, and walk between the parts together, as a symbolic way of saying, if I fail in my oath, if I break my covenant, may I be like these animals. May I be killed and my body broken and left to rot. Uh, and so God tells Abram to set up the ceremony. Abram carries out the instructions that God gives him for the ceremony, but then things go kind of off the rails. And remember, the elements of this story, the elements of this ceremony, the way that it normally goes is you set up the animal parts, and both parties state their part of the covenant, and then walk through together as a way of saying, may this happen to me if I fail to keep my promise. But Abram sets all these things up, and then he's waiting for God to come and to tell him what to do next, until about nightfall. And during this time, he's having to chase off the birds of prey, the eagles and the vultures that are coming along trying to take a bite. And so he's sitting there guarding the carcass, animal carcasses, the animal parts, from the birds. And suddenly God causes Abram to fall into a deep sleep. And so Abram conks out, and he ends up seeing the rest of what happens in a dream. And God pronounces this promise, tells him what's going to happen, and promises that he is going um, to make Abram into a great nation, that he's going to give him children. But as part of that, as part of the making of the promise, God also tells Abram several other things that are going to happen as part of this process, and even hints at the coming Exodus, the slavery in Egypt that happens between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, as we'll see. And the rescue from Egypt, and the fact that they're going to leave Egypt with plunder, leave Egypt with riches, and that they will come, they'll be brought eventually, finally, to the promised land, to the land of Canaan, and God will give it to his descendants. And all these things are going to happen, but they have to happen in the right time, because as the text says, if you look in Genesis 15 verse 16, it says the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So there's something going on there, and we'll talk about that in more detail when we get to Joshua a little bit later in the semester. But this is, the time is not right yet for Abram's family to take this land. God is promising it will happen, but there's other things. 400 years of separation and being in foreign land in Egypt, and slavery and mistreatment and rescue from that before you come back, and the land will belong to your family. And so God tells Abram all these things that are going to happen, but the short version, the in a nutshell version, is God promises that this land of Canaan that he has promised, he's going to give to Abraham's ancestors. It's going to happen, and it's waiting on the proper time. And then God appears or shows up in this really strange form, this weird image. It's a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch. And so I guess the kind of visual image or the pictures of a censer or a pot for burning incense as an offering to uh, like a part of a religious ceremony. And so this smoking fire pot, the smoking censer, and this bright blazing torch, this very bright light source, comes down and passes through the parts of the animals and is gone. And if you pay attention to this story, the way the story goes, and you know the Old Testament, that ancient Near Eastern custom for making covenants, you realize there's something weird going on. There's differences between the traditional covenant ceremony and what God does in this story. And the difference is one of the significant differences that God causes Abram to pass out. Abram isn't conscious. Abram is one of the parties in this covenant, but Abram makes no promises. Abram makes no oaths, and Abram doesn't even pass through the line of animals. All of that is done by God, and the implication is that there's really nothing Abram can do to fail this covenant. He doesn't make any promises. He doesn't take any oaths, and he doesn't walk between the parts of the animals. It is God alone that makes the promises, takes the oaths, and passes through the parts of the animals. And through that symbolically says, may what has happened to these animals happen to me if I fail to keep the promise. And that's significant because later on there's going to be other promises that God makes that are conditional. There are going to be other promises and other moments where God makes promises to Abraham and his descendants that are dependent on their faithfulness. They're dependent on their obedience. And they're doing what God tells them to do, or living in according to the rules and the law that God has given. There are going to be more conditional covenants later, but this covenant, this first time that God makes this covenant with Abram, it isn't conditional. There's Abram isn't even really involved other than the setup. He's not involved in the covenant making. God makes the promises. God passes through alone. And if you're looking back at this, I mean, this is one of those stories that I look back at as a Christian pastor, and when I'm looking at this text and preaching it, I can't help but see the connections to Christ, and that God makes these promises, and the symbolic nature of the covenant ceremony is, may what has happened to these animals happen to me. May I be killed and my body broken and left to rot if I fail to keep this promise. And then ultimately in Jesus, Christians believe God does allow himself to be killed, his body broken, and on the edge of a trash heap at Golgotha outside of Jerusalem, and is buried and left to rot, because he intends to keep this promise. That is part of the method or the mechanism that God uses to keep the promise made to Abram, that his family will be a blessing to all the families on earth. And so when I read this story as a Christian pastor and looking at it to preach, that's one of the things that I can't help but see, is that God does this. God makes this promise. God takes this self-maledictory oath that he will be broken, that he will be killed if he can't keep this promise. And then God uses the killing of himself, the killing of his son, uses that in order to keep the promise, to be a blessing, that Abram's family will be a blessing to all the families on earth. So that's a little bit of specifically Christian interpretation thrown in there. Most of the time I try to keep it as kind of general interpretation so that anybody is going to recognize it, understand it. But then there's moments along the way where I want to give you the specifically Christian interpretation, at least so you'll know what it is. And so there it is. That's like one of the things that is very striking the story as a Christian interpreter. It's that I look back into the story knowing what happens to Jesus, knowing the significance of Jesus, and I see that even in at this early point in Genesis, there is a recognition of the need for God to suffer in order to fulfill the promises, to be a blessing, to rescue humanity. Um, so that leads us to the end of chapter 15, beginning of chapter 16. In chapter 16, again, um, we have Abram not being the man that he needs to be, not being the great hero of the story that we want him to be. In this case, it begins with his wife Sarai, She is looking around. She hasn't had children. Abram hasn't had children, and she's old. She knows she's getting old, and doesn't think that she's going to be able to have children ever. And so she convinces Abram to take her handmaid Hagar. And Hagar, it says she is a slave from Egypt, and so Hagar is one of the things. I hate to talk about people that way, but in the culture of the time, it's like she is one of the expressions of wealth they brought out of Egypt. She is a handmaid that was given to Sarai by the Pharaoh, and Pharaoh didn't keep Hagar back, or didn't keep the people back that he had given to Abram and Sarai at the time. And so Hagar has been a servant to Sarai for all of that time since Egypt. And Hagar, or Sarai, convinces Abram to take Hagar as a second kind of subordinate wife. Um, the text flips back and forth between calling her a servant and calling her a wife, and so there may be something like in mind is like she's a secondary wife, or a something along the lines of a concubine, even though there's never any, that term is never used for Abram, even though it's used in other places in the Old Testament. Uh, and so part of the flipping back and forth may be to indicate this tension between the fact that Hagar has become Abram's wife, but he never really treats her as a wife, as we'll see. He doesn't really defend her or take care of her as he should a wife. And so that may be why the text kind of flips back and forth, is to keep this kind of tension in mind that she is his wife. He has taken this step, he's done this thing, but he isn't living up to the responsibilities and actually treating her as a wife. But Hagar, Sarai convinces Abram to take Hagar as a wife and sleep with her and try to produce children to carry on their family through Hagar. And the idea maybe that Sarai had in her head was that Hagar would just kind of be a surrogate womb for her, and this child would really be hers. But that, of course, that's not the way that things work out. Hagar does get pregnant, and shortly after that, and not long after that, Hagar starts to feel less servile. She isn't really a slave anymore. She is a wife, and so she doesn't want to just jump and do everything that Sarai tells her to do. And this angers Sarai, and she starts to mistreat her out of jealousy and out of the sense of entitlement to Hagar's obedience. And so she starts mistreating her, and Abram allows it. Specifically, Sarai comes to Abram and accuses him, blames him for Hagar's mistreatment, that Hagar isn't behaving the way Sarai thinks she should anymore. And Abram says, "Well, she's your servant. Do whatever you want with her," instead of saying, "No, she's my wife, and you have to learn to live with her. This was your idea. We did this at your suggestion. She is my wife. You should treat her that way." Instead, he says she is your servant, and kind of denies any responsibility towards her, and says, "Do with her as you will." And Sarai ends up mistreating her so badly that Hagar flees. Hagar runs away, thinking that she can do better. She's going to survive better elsewhere, despite having really nothing. Uh, but while after she has fled and finds a spring in the desert to stay alive, at least for the short term, an angel comes to her and recognizes her, sees her, knows that she is in desperate situation, and um, says that she should return to her master's household, and promises that this child that she bears will become a great nation. And so when the child is born, she names him Ishmael. And the name Ishmael means God who sees. And she names him this because God saw her suffering, saw her situation, and spoke to her and gave her direction, guidance. And so we'll see not only here, but then later as well, there's another instance where God rescues her, rescues her and her child from another situation where, again, Sarah at the time gets jealous and tries to drive them away. And that brings us to chapter 17. In chapter 17, God makes a covenant, or renews or repeats the covenant with Abram, only this time, instead of there being carcasses of dead animals, he gives Abram a sign of the covenant to perform, and it becomes a lasting sign of the covenant. And so God tells Abram that uh, he is going to give him a son, and not only a son through Hagar, but a son through Sarai, or Sarah, as her name is about to be changed. And during the course of this text, their names are changed. Abram is, he said, no longer will you be called Abram, but you'll be Abraham. Your name will be Abraham. And the same for Sarah. So her name has been Sarai, and says no longer will she be Sarai, but now Sarah. And so this is the passage in Genesis 17. This is the text where their names are changed. God gives them new names, which are tweaks of their old names, obviously, slight changes in meaning, but that's God gives them these new names. And also this covenant, as I mentioned earlier with the previous covenant, it was a one-sided covenant. It was an unconditional covenant. This is a covenant with conditions. This is a covenant that where God requires um, faithfulness and righteousness, that they live according to God's commands and do the things that God commands them to do. So the text says to walk before me faithfully and be blameless. And as part of this covenant, God requires Abram to do something. It's a sign of the covenant that God is giving to Abram, and the sign is circumcision. And if you are unfamiliar with that term, I always enjoy. I hate that I'm doing this part by video because I always love the look of kind of disturbed. What in the world is going on the faces of students that had no idea what circumcision was before class started? Um, but circumcision, if you're not familiar with it, circumcision is the ritual or surgical process to remove part of the foreskin from a boy or a man's penis. Uh, if you if you see images, or guys, if you have a natural uncircumcised penis, there is usually a significant flap of skin that folds over the head of the penis and covers it. Circumcision is a process or procedure that takes that excess skin and removes it. It cuts it off in a circle, a circumcision, which is why it's called circumcision. And so it just removes that excess skin off of the foreskin of the penis. It doesn't interfere with any other processes or anything else that the penis would do. It just removes that excess skin that normally folds over and covers the head on an uncircumcised penis. Um, and so this God gives this as a sign of the covenant for Abraham, he and his family, or he and his sons, and any male living in his household or in the households of his descendants. They are to have this performed, have this done. They are to have the foreskin of their penis removed, um, and so Abram, of course, he does this for himself and for his son Ishmael, and for all the other males in his household. But then, question people ask sometimes is why? And why does God choose this as a sign of the covenant? And it's not explained. It's not explained to us in the text why God says circumcision. It may be similar to the previous, covenant ceremonies that God had Abraham set up and that God passed through. It may be a kind of similar self-maledictory oath or a meeting. May it be cut off for me too, or may what comes from it be cut off. May my seed or my descendants, may my life and my descendants be cut off if I fail to keep the covenant. That may be part of it. There's another possibility that I have heard from commentators is that God may be saying, every time that you use this, I want you to remember me. That every time that you go to, have intercourse, with your wife or with anybody else, I want you to remember uh, whose you are, where you came from, and you know, let this act be an act of remembrance and of devotion to me. And if you're using it not according to my plan, outside of your marriage, uh, remember, note that I'm watching. So there are uh, those aren't certain. Those are just possibilities that I have heard mentioned. either as part of a self-maledictory oath or as just kind of a reminder of God's uh, wanting Abram and his descendants to have this ongoing reminder that this act that brings life is connected to their God, that their God is overseeing, and that this promise that God makes to Abram is being fulfilled through and by this act, and to never forget God's promise to them, and also to be aware that God knows what they're doing. But either way, God promises or commands circumcision for Abram and his descendants, Abraham and his descendants, and God promises Abraham that he will have a son through Sarah. And Abraham has this immediate reaction. He laughs at the idea that he is going to have a child with Sarah because they are both quite old at this point. And then in chapter 18, Genesis chapter 18, God appears or comes to speak with Abraham again. This time it's in this strange form of three men. Abram sees suddenly, just is aware, suddenly knows that there are these three men that are near his encampment. And the text says, "The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre where he was encamped, and while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. And Abram just looks up and sees three men standing nearby. So the Lord is appearing to him, and Abram sees these three men. And so he jumps up immediately and runs to them. And as you know, an ancient Near Eastern man of means would, offers them hospitality. But he seems to be especially eager to show them hospitality, eager to provide for them and to invite them in, as though Abram knows that this is more than just three guys passing by, right? That he knows that this is God's presence with them somehow, some form. And so he convinces the three men to come in and sit and be refreshed. And then he runs and tells Sarah to prepare a special meal quickly for these three men, and then runs back out to entertain them, to talk to them. And while they are talking, the one of the three men promises that Sarah would be pregnant and have a son by this time next year. That the this man, or that this group would return. That God would return. That God will come, and a year later, this time next year, Sarah would have given birth to a son. And Sarah overhears this as she's making the food nearby, uh, or is waiting, to wait on them. And so she's standing there nearby, and she overhears this promise, and she starts laughing at the idea that she is going to, one, that she's going to enjoy pleasure from her husband at this age, and two, that she's going to be able to be pregnant. And then this man, up to this point in the text, the person speaking, it's always been referred to as one of the men or the man. And then all of a sudden, it's the Lord says to Abraham, uh, why did Sarah laugh when I said you will have a son? And Sarah immediately is frightened and tries to deny that she said it. But God tells her, yes, you did. You did laugh. And then the men stand up, and two of the men go and leave, and the last one tells Abraham what God is intending to do about the city of Sodom. And God has seen or heard the wickedness of the city, and is sending these two men that are going to be referred to as angels in the next chapter, sending them to check out and to make sure that wickedness is as bad as it seems. And this third one, the angel, potentially the angel of the Lord, is a reference that we'll see a lot of times later in the text, where God is speaking to one of the people, and you know, this third man, this angel of the Lord, stays back and speaks to Abram and tells him what he's going to do, that he's going to destroy Sodom by fire because of the great wickedness of the city. And Abram immediately starts trying to plead and to bargain with God to spare the city. And the tack that he takes is, God, it would not be right for you as the perfectly just God to rain down fire on both the good and the bad at the same time, to destroy both the just and the unjust at the same time. So would you destroy the city if there are even 50, if there are 50 good people there, if there are 50 righteous people there, would you still destroy the city? And God says, no, for the sake of 50, I would not destroy it. And then Abram says, well, what if there are five less than that? For the sake of five less, would you destroy the city over five? And God says, no, if there are five less than 50, I would not destroy the city. And then Abram keeps coming back after that and says, well, how about 40 and then 30 and then 20 and then 10? And each time God says, no, even for that many, I would not destroy the city. If there were that many righteous people in the city, I would not destroy it. I will spare it if there are even that many righteous in the city. And each time Abram is getting more and more nervous about asking again. It's like, well, what about 40? Well, okay, I mean, don't get angry, but what about 30? Please don't get angry with me. But what about 20? That's all. This is the last time I'll ask, and please don't be angry with me. But what about even 10? Um, and each time God says, no, for the sake of that number, I would not destroy the city. And then we move over into the next chapter where really terrible things happen. And these other two men, or the angels as they've been revealed to be, go on down to Sodom. And they come into the city, and we find that Lot is sitting in the gateway. He's sitting at the gates. And this sitting at the gates of the city is something that prominent men in the city would do. The elders and leaders of the city would gather there. The prominent businessmen of the city would gather there to conduct business. It was a place that you could go and be reasonably sure that you were going to have witnesses for important agreements. Uh, and so prominent men would tend to go and sit at an area near the gates of these cities and conduct business. And Lot is now sitting in the gates of the city. Remember, he started out choosing to go towards Sodom because the land was really green and it looked really great. And he pitched his tent close to Sodom. And then when Abram has to go and rescue him, he is living in the city. And now, as just a couple chapters later, he is sitting at the gates of the city amongst the prominent men and the influential businessmen in the city. And so he has, risen in the world. He has become an influential, important figure in Sodom. And he sees these men coming in, and he goes to them and immediately offers them hospitality and begs them to come and stay in his home. And the two men initially say, "No, we won't. We're not going to do that. We're not going to accept your hospitality. Instead, we're going to sleep in the square of the city tonight." And Lot begs them not to do that and to come and stay in his home. And so they eventually agree and they come and stay in his home. And then soon after that, before it's fully dark, the men of the city, men out of Sodom, from all over the city, the text says, come and start demanding that Lot bring his guests out, bring these men out, so that they can have sex with them. They want to rape the angelic men that have come and stayed in Lot's household. And there's two major problems with this. One is the rape and the homosexual element for the Old Testament, uh, and in the New Testament as well. But that rape element especially is really rough. That's not okay, clearly. But then there's also the violation of hospitality, which would have been a really big deal in the ancient Near East. It's like if you brought somebody under your house and you made them a guest under your roof, you took responsibility for them, and to go to somebody else and to demand that they break hospitality for something this carnal, it would have been just seen as just gross and ugly and mean. It would have been a violation of the kind of social norms of a really extreme, extravagant degree. And then the rape part, that's horrible. And so this is a all around for both historical and social context reasons and just kind of general morality reasons. This is really abundantly evil. And they're there and they're demanding that he bring out these young men, and Lot, trying to appease them and to de-escalate the situation, offers his daughters instead. And so he says, I have two virgin daughters. Let me bring them out, and you can have your way with them, and instead of these men that are staying under my roof tonight. And so, not fathership of the highest quality here. Clearly, he's going to toss his daughters out to be raped by the men of the city to save the young men that he's just met. But the men of the city won't have it. They don't want his virgin daughters. They want the men. They want the guests that have come and stay in the city. They want these angelic young men that came in. And so they start like cursing at at Lot and reminding him that he was a foreigner in this city. And they start trying to break down his gate when the angels strike the men blind. They curse them with blindness, and then pull Lot into his house and close the door and lock it, and then warn Lot that because of the evil of the city, God is going to destroy it, and God is going to destroy it in the morning. And so to gather his family and get out of the city. And the story, the text actually says that Lot's daughters were engaged to be married to young men in the city, and so Lot goes to these households of these young men and begs them to come and join him and his family in fleeing the city to flee the destruction. But the sons-in-law, the fiancés of his daughters, are convinced that he's joking or it's a trick or something, and so they laugh at him and won't come with him. And so eventually Lot goes and gathers his wife and his daughters and what they could carry and leaves, flees from the city. And as he's fleeing, they end up they don't want to have to run all the way out of the valley, because it's not just Sodom and the neighboring town Gomorrah that are known for this wickedness and are going to be destroyed. God is going to rain judgment on all of these different cities in the plain. But there's this one particular town that Lot bargains with or argues with, or begs the angels to spare. And so there's one particular town very near the edge of the valley that God agrees to spare, so that Lot and his family has somewhere to go. Uh, and they flee, but as they're fleeing, one of the instructions that they were given, one of the things the angels told them was, don't look back at the city, flee without looking back. And Lot's wife turns and looks back at the city and is transformed into a pillar of salt. And there is actually like a geological formation that you can go to in Israel today that is called Lot's wife, uh, because of the assumption it's composed out of salt, uh, like a heavily high salt content stone, and it's called Lot's wife because of the assumption that this is actually the pillar of salt that Lot's wife was transformed into. And so they flee, and actually Lot and his daughters end up fleeing and hiding in the mountains instead of in the town that they had bargained to be spared so they could go to there. And something, well, really gross happens while they're there. Lot's daughters get it into their head that because Lot's wife is dead, or is no more. That their mother is no more, is a pillar of salt now, and they have no husbands. Lot's family line is going to die with them. There's they got no hope of producing children in their circumstances, and so Lot's family line is going to end with them. And so they decide that the way that they can remedy this situation is to have children with Lot. And so they get their father drunk one night, and the eldest daughter goes in, and while he's drunk and not really aware of what's going on, the daughter sleeps with him and gets pregnant. And the next night they do the same thing. They get him drunk, and the younger daughter goes in and sleeps with him and gets pregnant. And so they have this incestual race relationship, or at least incestual contact. And both of the daughters get pregnant, and they give birth to sons. And one is named Moab, and the other is named Ben-Ami. And these end up being these two sons born from this incestual relationship end up being the forefathers of two of the nations that are significant problems for Israel in the future. Moab means his name actually means, or it sounds like, there's a character in Hebrew that's just an M sound, and it's put in front of a lot of things, and it's the preposition out of or from. And so Moab sounds like the phrase you would expect for "from my father" or "from father." And so Moab, from father, is one of them, and he becomes the father of the Moabites, that are going to be a significant struggle for the people of Israel in later contexts, Exodus or Numbers and after. And then there's Ben Ami, which is son of my father or son of my father's people. the again, kind of referencing that incestuous relationship, and the nation that comes from him, or his descendants, become the Ammonites, this tribe that is again a major uh, obstacle to Israel at a later point. So that this is kind of where Lot's story ends, where we stop hearing about what's going on with Lot, with the incestual relationship between him and his two daughters after the destruction of Sodom and the conversion of his wife into salt, and the two family lines that come from him end up being kind of family uh, family feud for later generations of Israelites. In Genesis chapter 20, we have another scenario, another situation where Abraham tries to pass off his wife as a sister. In this case, it is Abimelech, who is the king of a significant region of Canaan. Um, and Abraham has settled in this region, and he again is telling people that Sarah is his sister rather than his wife. And again, this king sees Sarah and wants her to be his wife, and he intends to marry her. But this time, God gives Abimelech a warning, gives this king a warning in a dream, and he is warned not to touch her, not to have anything to do with her. And Abimelech is extremely angry with Abraham for trying to pass off his wife as a sister and to put him in a situation where he's going to commit adultery and be judged and condemned by Abraham's God. But because he is afraid of God, because he fears and respects this God that spoke to him in a dream and warned him, he gives gifts to Sarah and to Abraham, and gives Abraham permission to live anywhere in his land that he wants. Um, yeah, as kind of trying to make peace with Abraham and this God that would end his family line for sleeping with Abraham's wife. And as part of this, as part of the confrontation between Abimelech and Abraham, Abraham reveals that Sarah is actually his half sister, which we weren't really told up to this point. But he and Sarah share the same father, but not the same mother. And so Sarah is his half sister. His wife is his half sister. Uh, yeah, we get some weird relationships in the Old Testament, and some of them are blessed and some of them are not. Um, at this point, though, to be fair to Abraham, God had not given a specific commandment against this. That doesn't come until Moses' time. So Abraham had not been given a specific command against marrying his close family members, but it's definitely strange. Uh, but the outcome of this, again, this is, if you remember back to the situation with Egypt, Abraham comes out of that situation wealthier because God protects him. God provides for him while he's there, even though he's not doing what he ought to do. And here again, the situation, Abraham is not doing what he ought to do. He is not believing, not trusting God enough to tell the truth about who his wife is and prevent these kind of situations from coming up. But God provides for him and gives him something that he wouldn't have had otherwise through it. And it's through this situation that Abraham gets permission to live in Gerar, and he, for the first time, is able to settle and live in the land of Canaan, at least a part of it. And he's able to live in the land of Canaan as a foreigner, but with the permission, with the go ahead of the king. He's like, I guess you could say he is a legal resident, not just a passerby or a tourist, uh, even though he doesn't own any part of the land yet. A situation does come up a little later where when Sarah dies, Abraham buys a plot of land that includes a cave so that he can bury Sarah, and so he becomes an owner of a portion of the land, and that's the first plot of land that he owns in the Promised Land. But again, because of the situation with Abimelech, Abraham is able to actually settle in the land with the permission of the people that live there, and he gets at least a taste of the promise that God had made being fulfilled. He gets to at least live in the land that God has promised someday his descendants will control, that it will be given to them. So that's again that's Genesis chapter 20. Then in Genesis chapter 21, we have the kind of return of Sarah's well, insecurity and um, jealousy towards Hagar and Ishmael. And it's, the child of the promise, the child that God had promised over and over again that Sarah would have is finally here. Isaac is born, and so this boy is born, and they name him Isaac. And the name Isaac, interestingly, means laughter. And this is, Sarah says at the time that she gives him the name Isaac, because God has brought me laughter. But it's also kind of a tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that both Abraham and Sarah laughed at God when he said that they would have a child together. It was difficult for either of them to believe. So they laugh at the idea. They laughed at God when God said that they would have this child. And so God tells them that they are to name the child Isaac. Laughter, as a constant reminder of their not believing, not trusting God. And so they name him Laughter. They name him Isaac, and he starts to grow up. And there's this tension that starts to come up. There is a kind of there's this tension that grows up between Sarah and Hagar, because Sarah keeps seeing Ishmael, Abraham's older son, by Hagar, and now she's looking at her son Isaac, who was in her eyes, the legitimate son, the son of Abraham's true wife, his marriage, instead of this slave girl that has gotten, too big for her britches. And so Sarah gets really upset uh, at Ishmael and Hagar still being there, and she demands that Abraham send them away, that he put them out of his household, because there is no way, Sarah says, no way is my son going to inherit with the son of the slave girl. And again, this was Abraham took Hagar as wife. He had an obligation to treat her that way, but instead he continued to treat her as a slave woman and never defended her, stepped up for her. So Abraham fails in a pretty significant way as husband here, uh, more than once. And so this time, Abraham realizes that this is a pretty permanent thing. If he puts them away, he may never see his son again. There's no guarantee that they're even going to survive, because the world is not a super friendly place. And take this woman and her teenage son and send them out, and who knows what's going to happen. Um, and so he dithers and doesn't agree right away, but uh, later God comes to him while he is in angst about this. He comes and tells Abraham to go ahead and do what his wife wants. Go ahead and do what Sarah asked him to do. And God promises that he will take care of Hagar and Ishmael will become a great nation as well. It's just that Ishmael will become a nation that opposes Isaac's descendants, that there will be opposition and conflict between them. And so Abraham goes back and does what God told him to do. He tells Sarah that they'll do as she intends, and he takes Hagar and Ishmael and gives them some basic provisions and sends them off to go and find their own fortune, to make it as best they can, which wasn't well. I mean, that there weren't many options, and so it's not long before the provisions, the skin of water that they were given, has run out, and they are desperate in the wilderness, and they're about to die. They're near death, but God sends another angel to rescue them and provides a spring for them, and they're able to drink and have food. And God reiterates the promise to Hagar that this child will become a great nation. That brings us to the last chapter that we're going to look at, for this video, at least for this lecture. And it's a significant story. I mean, it's a big deal in the studying the Old Testament. But it's the story of Abraham being tested at Mount Moriah. In the text, the story is that God tells Abraham to go and take his son, and it's very striking the way that the story is told. It's sometimes later God tests Abraham and says to him, Abraham. He just calls out Abraham's name, and Abraham says, "Here I am." And then God says, "Go and take this son, your son Isaac, your only son, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him to me there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you. And so it's kind of like it's almost like uh, a it's a sharp contrast with the instructions that God gave Moses or God gave to Abraham in the first place. When we see Abraham or Abram for the first time in chapter 12, God says, Go to a place that I will show you, and I will make you into a great nation. I'll give you this line of descendants." And now here God has finally provided the son through Sarah, through his wife, that is supposed to be the fulfillment of this promise. And God starts to give the same command and says, "Sacrifice this son, the son of the promise, to me as a burnt offering. Go to this mountain that I will show you and do this." And so there's this kind of like sharp contrast between these two commands, and that they kind of mirror image each other. And so it's kind of like the story of Abraham is being bracketed by these two things: God's command to go, the call to go, and to follow him to a nation, to a place that he doesn't know, that he's not going to name. And God will make him a great nation and give him a family. And now, after changing his name to Father of a Multitude, Abraham, he's now giving him this kind of bracketed opposite instruction: Go and sacrifice to me the son on a mountain that I'm not going to name. I'm not going to tell you until you get there, to this place that I will show you later. Go to this unknown place and sacrifice this son through which you believe I'm going to fulfill the promise I originally made to you. Go and sacrifice him to me there. And this we'll talk a little bit, as we get to the end, about why God does this. But it's a sharp, striking contrast to what God had told Abram at the beginning. And so these two commands kind of serve as bookends, or this kind of encapsulating uh, shape to the story of Abraham. And so Abraham is told to do this, and there's nothing in the text that he agrees, but he gets up in the morning and he takes a donkey and goes out and cuts wood, and then comes back and takes Isaac and takes his one of his servants and everything that he would need for a sacrifice, and he goes out and sets off with his son. And they travel for 3 days. And on the third day, Abraham looks up and he sees this mountain. They're in the right region, and he sees this mountain, and that's where he's supposed to go. He knows that's where he's supposed to go. And so he tells his servant to stay there with the donkey, and that Isaac and Abraham would go on and worship God. And so he puts the wood on Isaac's back, the wood that he had cut to be able to burn for the sacrifice. He puts the wood on Isaac's back, and they go up the mountain together. And Abraham is carrying the knife and the fire, and a torch or some means of lighting a fire. And Isaac is carrying the wood for the sacrifice, to burn the sacrifice. And they start at the mountain, and Isaac speaks up and he says, "Father," and Abraham says, "Yes, my son." And Isaac says, I see the fire and I see the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham replies and says, "God himself will provide the lamb, my son." And the two of them go on and they carry it up, and they reach the place, and Abraham takes stones that he finds there and assembles them together, builds an altar of uncut stones, which is the way that God commands the altars to be built in the future. And so he constructs this altar of stones, and they arrange the wood on it, and then he takes his son and ties him up, binds him to the altar, and then goes to strike him, goes to kill him with the knife. And as he reaches out his hand and takes the knife to kill his son, uh, God speaks and says, "Abraham, Abraham." And just like at the beginning of the chapter, Abraham replies, "Here I am." And God says or the angel of the Lord says, "Don't lay a hand on the boy." And again, the angel of the Lord is the one speaking here, which is God speaking to Abraham. And the angel of the Lord says, God says, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Don't harm him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." And then Abraham looks up and sees there in a nearby thicket, thick brush, he sees a young ram or a lamb caught by its horns, and he goes and takes that ram and releases his son, and he and his son together take this ram and sacrifice it to God in Isaac's place. And so it becomes this you know the ram is a substitute for Isaac. And Abraham ends up naming the place, naming this mountain. He names it by this Hebrew phrase that means the Lord will provide. And the text says that to this day, the time in the future when the text is being written or after it's being edited, to this day it is said, it's a common, in common parlance, it's a common phrase among the people of Israel, even in that time centuries later, that on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided, that God will provide on his mountain. And so the mountain of the Lord will be provided. If you go with God, God provides. And so that becomes the kind of the moral, the meaning of this story. That's what the text offers as the meaning of the story, is that God does provide. But it's also there's a lot of other stuff going on in the story, and one of the questions that comes up is, why does God command this? So before I get to that, though, there's one thing that I want to kind of clarify. A lot of people see this as, a lot of times they'll see this as, you know Abraham taking advantage or victimizing Isaac, and it's certainly not good for Isaac. But remember the details of the story here. We kind of just a couple of chapters ago heard Isaac has been born, right? And so we're still thinking of him as a very young child. But Isaac went on a 3-day journey with his father and then was loaded up with enough wood to burn a burnt offering. And he carries this wood all the way up a mountain. And he's able to look around and see what is there and ask his father very relevant questions. And so this is not a child that we're dealing with anymore. This is, I mean, a teenager, at least 16, 17 years old. And Abraham is over 100 years old. Isaac is a strong enough young man to carry this load of wood all the way up the mountain. If he is not cooperating with Abraham, Abraham is not going to do anything to him. He has got to lay down on this altar of his own free will and allow his father to bind his hands, because Abraham's never going to be able to overpower him at his age. And so Isaac cooperates with Abraham for this. This is somehow, some way, this is what Isaac believes. He trusts his father, or he trusts God enough to believe that this is somehow what God intends. And so he goes willingly to the altar, as hard as that is to understand. But there's no way that Abraham, at well over 100 years old, is going to be able to force his strapping young, just carried a large load of wood all the way up a mountain for him son to do anything that he doesn't want to do. So that's just an aside, and kind of a detail in the story that often gets missed, is that or Isaac is very obviously a strong, capable young man that could have stopped Abraham from doing anything that he wasn't willing to do. But then there's that question: why does God command this? Why does God require this of Abraham? Does God not know what Abraham will do? Does he not know that Abraham is faithful without doing this? And isn't it cruel to try to force Abraham to slaughter his son, or to even put him in the situation where he believes he will have to slaughter his son, just to prove something for God, or something, as this kind of a test? Isn't this a cruel test? But there's several things that I think are going on that come out because of this, or are good results or positive results because of this. One is that, remember that Abraham is counted righteous because of his trust in God. That's the nature of Abraham. That's why he is able to be the father of this family line. This is why he is considered righteous before God. He's counted righteous because of his faith, because he trusts. And so this is kind of an ultimate expression of trust, because not just because he's willing to sacrifice his son, whom he loves, but because he is willing to sacrifice and give up the method or the mechanism through which God is going to fulfill his promises to him. In the New Testament, we get the insinuation that Abraham believed that God could raise Isaac from the dead. That's one of the things that we see in the book of Hebrews, is that the author says that Abraham believed that Isaac could be raised from the dead, and so he was willing to sacrifice him because of that. Whatever Abraham's core belief was here, he trusted that if he went through with this, God would still fulfill his promise somehow. And he was showing, by doing this, by his willingness to do this, Abraham demonstrated that he was trusting God more than the methods that God used, and he was pursuing, desiring, trusting God more than the things that God would provide, the blessings that God promised to give. So that's a significant change in the way that Abraham's story goes. Because if you think about what Abraham has done up to this point, he has hedged his bet several times. He's called his wife his sister twice because he was afraid of what would happen, and he sleeps with takes Hagar as his wife because he's afraid that God will not provide a son through Sarah and through his wife. And so Abraham does these things all along the way to hedge his bets. And now here there is this moment where he ultimately, like in a very obvious way, does not hedge his bets. He goes full on trusting God. If he kills Isaac, if he sacrifices Isaac, and God does not give him another son or raise Isaac from the dead, then all of the promises that God has made to him will be for nothing. He will not have a family after him. His descendants will not take the land. His family will not be a blessing to all the families on earth. None of these things can happen if he has no sons, and so he has to go all in, no bets hedged, trusting in God. And it's not just that God does this to make Abraham prove that he's willing to do this. It's and this is true for all kinds of testing. It's not God testing me or anybody else. It's not just that, in the process I prove that I am X, Y, or Z. It's that by the process of the testing I become that. I become faithful because I have been tested. And Abraham, when it's been put to a point, when it's been put to this point, he becomes this faithful man. He becomes the man that doesn't hedge his bets and fully trust in God. And so this nature of, Abraham's nature, his the reason that he is acceptable as the patriarch of this family line, that is going to do these things and be the family line that God is going to save the human race through. The reason that he can be that is because he is faithful. He trusts God, and this is the moment where that trust is expanded and cemented and put to its ultimate paces, and it becomes its ultimate extreme. It's not just that he demonstrates the ultimate extremes of his faith, but his faith is expanded and actually grows to become this. And through this process, Abraham actually learns more about who God is, because he learns that God is the one who provides. God provides the land, and he even foreshadows it when he tells his son Isaac that the Lord himself is going to provide the land, my son. And whether he was saying that with full trust at the time or not, don't know. Maybe he was just trying to convince Isaac to go on ahead. But at the one way or another, he fully believes it at that point, or he's foreshadowing what's to come. God does provide on this mountain, and that becomes not only a truism, a statement that Abraham lives by on that day, but and for the rest of his life, but is for generations, is a statement about God's nature that the people of Israel believe, and they're still saying it all the way down to whenever the book of Genesis is being finally edited and published in the form that we have it. Even to that day, people say, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided, because of what happens here with Abraham. So Abraham's character is formed through this. His faith, it's not just that his faith is tested; it is grown through this, and Abraham learns, and the people of Israel learn something about God's character that they would not have known otherwise, or in a way that they couldn't have seen it, known it otherwise. So that's where we'll stop. This is already a pretty long lecture. It would have been an hour and 15 minutes if we only had one class, and we're at an hour and 45 now. So yeah, this is about one and a half classes worth, to make up for the two classes that we missed this week. We'll be back next Tuesday, and on first Tuesday in February. I think that's February 3rd. I don't have a calendar up where I can see it right now, but so we'll be back in class in person next week. Make sure that you have taken notes. The contents of this video, the contents of this lecture will be fair game for exams, so make sure that you know it. The story of Abraham is so important, so significant, and we'll have another couple of references to Abraham in the next section, but we're going to be moving on to Isaac and Jacob primarily. But his story is so significant; it is so transitional for the people of Israel, for the rest of the study of the Old Testament. So you really need to know this material. And I hate that it is having to come in this form because of us missing some class. But make sure that you have understood it as best you can. Go back over it if you need to rewatch it. Take good notes, and be prepared for the exam to come. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or to catch me before or during class when we come back next week. or after, and I will do my best to answer and make anything that I haven't made clear as clear to you as I can. Good luck. God bless. And we'll see you back next week.